the institutional arrangements and the money that gave rise to these luxury beliefs was part of the problem. And so I like to think about spreading education and knowledge around to everybody. And if you do that, then you're going to have to deal with differences. You're going to have free marketer people and libertarians and, intellectual conservatives. And we got to figure out some ways of having institutions where we can talk those things out.
This is Viewpoints, a deeper look into the ideas that shape our politics and culture. Break free from the orthodoxies of mainstream media and hear diverse perspectives from interesting people across the political spectrum. Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Sean Rasmussen. With me today is Dr. Neil McLaughlin, professor of sociology at McMaster University. His research includes the sociology of public intellectuals, the sociology of reputations, and the sociological dynamics of universities and ideas. He's currently working on the political correctness debates and the Jordan Peterson controversy, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Neil McLaughlin, welcome to Viewpoints.
Thank you so much.
What got you interested in the study of sociology?
I got a soccer scholarship in the U.S. I'm Canadian. I grew up in Montreal, and I went to university at Cleveland State University. And essentially, I saw a lot of the poverty in the inner city Cleveland. Learned about the civil rights movement, and I started thinking about things beyond the soccer field. And sociology was a way that helped me understand what was going on in the world. So that's what happened.
And how would you describe the sociological approach to looking at issues?
Well, I think, it's funny about sociology. One of the things we'll talk about, and I appreciate your podcast, looking at different viewpoints. And so sociology has a reputation for being a kind of a left-wing dominated discipline, which is somewhat true today. But it wasn't really true when it started. So sociology was like a response to the French Revolution that was quite a conservative discipline. Okay. And there's a whole line of conservative thinkers. And because from that perspective, from this, really like before the French Revolution, the focus is on society, community, the kind of hierarchy.
Interesting.
History, tradition, imagination, not science.
Okay.
So sociology has this kind of conservative origin. But today it's about society in groups, families, educational institutions, religion, interactions. It's sort of, we focus on, political scientists focus on politics, economists on the market, psychologists on the brain and emotions, and we do the group dynamics.
And what would you say are the strengths and weaknesses of this approach?
I think people live our lives in groups with other people and interactions, everyday interactions. And you're in the elevator, how you interact in the elevator, and sociologists study that and have interesting things to say about that. And I think we don't get caught up. Maybe markets are important, but not everything's about economics. And individual psychology is important, but not everything is about the brain. There's also group behavior. So I think we have a really important angle to focus on that. But maybe a weakness, I think, today is I do think we are a bit one-sided politically, and that kind of gets in the way of, I think sociology works best when it has a little bit of a distance from the political, social issues of the day, kind of looks at things in a kind of a little bit more objective or distance way. And sometimes we lose that. So
I was going to touch on this later, but maybe you've kind of led into that now, which is your interest in this organization called the Heterodox Academy. Can you talk a little bit about that and what your involvement is with that?
Yeah, well, Jonathan Haidt has sort of wrote this really important book, Righteous Minds, of how people get kind of wrapped up in fighting about ideas, about religion. Mm-hmm. And it's a really important book, where he offers a theory about what are the moral foundations for different people's viewpoints. And it's powerful because he shows that conservatives, liberals, leftists, they all have a moral way of thinking about this. So it's not just a one-sided, conservatives are right and leftists are wrong, and the other way around. So that's his the signature book that he did, and then he followed it up with this book called The Coddling of the American Mind, which is in 2017 was really 18. So it was really about kind of the the campus wars, the political correctness wars that we've been living under. And I think he really has made a very strong case that we need to push for more viewpoint diversity and maybe coddle students less and kind of try to encourage students to have be exposed to different ideas. And so I'm very committed to that.
And so he started up this Heterodox Academy to kind of promote this viewpoint diversity through.
Yeah, that's viewpoint diversity, constructive open inquiry, constructive engagement, viewpoint diversity. So it's a nonprofit in the U.S. and they've raised a fair amount of money. And in the U.S., they have a lot of university administrators and kind of well-known intellectuals are involved in it. And it's been kind of chugging along and having quite a lot of success. There's a Canadian version of that I've been involved and then trying to make that happen. And so, there's sort of occasional meetings at the national level. And then there's a chapter at the University of Toronto where I have a courtesy appointment in the history and philosophy of the sciences and technology program. So I'm active in the Toronto chapter, and I've just started a chapter at McMaster to try and open up the university to different viewpoints.
And what does that look like in practice, the heterodox approach to talking about ideas?
Well, they have like 5 different kind of principles. One is when you're having intellectual debates or conversations, you should sort of base things on evidence. That's sort of one issue. Be generous in your intellectual, steel man arguments.
Sure.
And kind of like try and listen to the person that you're disagreeing with in the most generous way possible. Not assume bad faith and then be constructive in how you engage with people and try and move the conversation forward instead of, canceling people is sort of the extreme of that one. It don't. And then be humble and sort of be aware of how the limits of our knowledge. And so trying to get away from the righteousness that sometimes happens, and then try to be yourself, like say what you think, so those are the principles. And so they work on a lot of different things. There's a website, you can find it, and they have discussions about kind of policies and how to have policies at the university that encourages that. They run like paired debates where they'll have 2 people who have a very different view on a particular issue, and they'll sort of try and model that. I don't think we do that very well in the universities. They sort of have one professor says this and another professor says that. I don't think we really teach students to kind of engage with, and so I think Heterodox is trying to do that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And what's the reception of that kind of approach? I know that there's probably some resistance to it, or
yeah. I think they're kind of caught in the polarization that we're seeing in the world. I think that I think in the U.S. some people see the organization as kind of a kind of right-leaning, conservative, maybe not Trumpist, but kind of like soft on Trumpist kind of thing, which I don't think is at all true. I mean, there's conservatives and moderates and leftists in this organization. It's a very diverse organization, but some people think that they're too conservative or too soft on conservatives. And of course, some of the more Trumpist political actors don't see it as they see it as kind of a soft version of leftism, kind of.
Yeah.
So I think they're kind of caught in between that, but I think they do a pretty good job of trying to go beyond those polarities.
Yeah. I've been following it closely, actually. I found it pretty interesting, and because I was concerned a little bit about what I was seeing out of the universities in terms of cancel culture and lack of curiosity, intellectual curiosity about what other people are thinking.
Well, you're totally right to be concerned. I think that's a big issue in the United States, and it's a problem here in Canada too.
Not just in the schools either.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I totally agree.
We're going to talk about the Jordan Peterson controversy on that, but let's first talk a little bit about public intellectuals and what we can learn by studying them. So in your way of looking at things, what is a public intellectual?
Well, the thing about that is like, I'm kind of like a sociologist of knowledge and a theorist. So I don't come from the kind of scientific sociology wing of the discipline, and I respect that and value it. I'm a little bit more interested in sort of the thinking about the terms and the definitions and how it's part of the debate that's going on. So I always teach my students, that there's not one definition of a public intellectual. It's actually sort of like what you define as a public intellectual. I mean, I could give you kind of a working definition. It's somebody who deals with ideas about politics, about economics, about culture, philosophy, and communicates those ideas to people outside of professional circles or experts. So that kind of some kind of engagement outside of the university or kind of closed professional firms or kind of a public. You have to kind of be doing something like that.
Sure. So obviously Jordan Peterson is an example of this, but who else would that be? Would Stephen Hawking be that person?
Oh, for sure he would, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so Stephen Hawking would be, and Charles Taylor, Margaret Atwood. Yeah. There's those. That's the kind of, although they don't always have to be famous. It could be somebody in a local community that, and the internet and podcasts are sort of an example of how what that means is being expanded, and that's kind of a good thing. But if you think about like Noam Chomsky, he would be your classic public intellectual of the left.
Yeah.
And Jordan Peterson would be the public intellectual of the right.
Okay.
And so what I'm interested in is not so much because I'm a sociologist of ideas and knowledge. I don't see myself as sort of the chairman of the public intellectual committee where I get to decide, who gets to be a public intellectual. That approach is really kind of, very much against the sociological profession. What I find interesting is if you don't like Noam Chomsky and you think he's too radical, then you define him as a kind of a left-wing nutbar, not a public intellectual. But if you like him, you think he's a public intellectual. And it's the same thing with Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
If you agree with him or many things he says, he's Canada's most famous public intellectual. And if you ask liberals or leftists who don't like Jordan Peterson, they'll spew out their coffee if someone calls Jordan Peterson a public intellectual. So it's sort of that battle over how intellectual do you have to be a public intellectual? Who gets to define what's intellectual? What publics count? It's sort of the battle over that issue that I think is kind of interesting.
And I guess just too, there's always been a little bit of a snobbery, right, of people who are in disciplines where it's like a gated discipline.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I started my career writing about a psychoanalyst and a sociologist named Erich Fromm. And he was kind of like the Jordan Peterson of the 40s and 50s.
Okay.
He was a clinician. He was a psychoanalyst. He wrote best-selling books, and he was kind of on the left. But he wrote a famous book called The Art of Loving, which sold 26 million copies.
Wow.
I mean, I wrote a piece on how do you become a forgotten intellectual. And Erich Fromm became forgotten because he was writing books that were clearly written, they were helping people, that people understood. And that really outraged the academics of the time. So absolutely, academic mandarins, they're very envious or suspicious of people who write to the public. But I, of course, think we should engage with the public.
Yeah. I really like the story you told on a podcast I heard you appear on, where you told the story of how you read a book by Erich Fromm when you were a young man, and how it kind of influenced you. Can you tell a bit about that story?
Yeah, I was, I didn't go to CEGEP, if you, the Quebec system. I went to, on the soccer scholarship, but I had a friend who read a book called Escape from Freedom, which was a best-selling book that Fromm wrote in 1941, trying to explain the social psychology of the Nazis. And what he argued, basically, was a German-Jewish refugee or exile from the Nazi period. And what he basically said is that you can't understand Hitler and the Nazis without some understanding of psychology. But it's not just a psychological dynamic. It's both a psychological and a historical dynamic. And so this book, it was very well written and kind of helped mobilize people. Fromm was a leftist, but he was trying to mobilize the United States to enter into the war and to defeat the Nazis.
Yeah.
And so that book, but in the book, he talks about Marx, he talks about existentialism. He's actually very similar to Peterson in that way. Mm-hmm. And Freud, Max Weber, Hobbes, Rousseau.
Yeah.
So he kind of gives you these introduction to the great theorists and the great thinkers, but he sums it up in a nice way. He kind of gives you an easy way in to this and shows people. I mean, I think sometimes academic mandarins, they kind of introduce you to great thinkers in a way that tries to bamboozle you. That's what my father used to say. Intellectuals, I like to bamboozle people. And so create boundaries. Say like, we're really smart intellectuals and not so smart. And Fromm had a different style. He was inviting, sort of here's some ideas, and probably if you're young, you could learn stuff from people who lived before you were born, and you should learn about the past. But it's so don't be arrogant. But at the same time, it's possible to think about ideas and come to your own conclusion. So that's what Erich Fromm.
And that's sort of one of the first early books where that really turned you on.
Yeah, that Escape from Freedom. I definitely recommend it. It's definitely worth reading.
Okay.
It has its flaws and its things that it misses, but it's an incredible book. I used to teach it in theory. It's a kind of a good way to introduce sociological theory, because he introduces Marx, he introduces Weber, he introduces Freud and Durkheim, and then uses it to explain the Nazis. And essentially what I noticed is that I was also involved in something called the Democratic Socialists of America, which is Michael Harrington was my mentor. And it was a different kind of organization from what it is today. But what I noticed is that Erich Fromm had an enormous influence on sociologists who read Erich Fromm when they were young and then became professional sociologists. And he had enormous influence also on political activists, made people into democratic socialists.
Okay.
But
is Chris Rufo like rolling in it?
Well, we could talk about, the thing about Chris Rufo is we could talk about that. But within the elite of sociology, or within the elite of the political left, there's a whole bunch of people who were influenced by Fromm, but when they got into the leadership of those organizations, they kind of left Fromm behind. He was kind of seen as too simplistic.
Okay.
So I was kind of interested in that. Like, what's that about? Like, what happens when people set up boundaries as the sociological elite or the political elites, and how they're missing what got them into these ideas in the first place? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the Rufo thing, I do think. I mean, the irony is that Erich Fromm was part of something called the Frankfurt School, or the critical theorists, and he was part of the group. And Rufo makes his story about the American Cultural Revolution. The central figure in that is Herbert Marcuse. Mm-hmm. And Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse knew each other and had similarities, but Fromm was a major critic of Marcuse. So I actually think that Fromm gives you he's essentially a democratic socialist, but he's anti-woke. He's kind of an anti-woke leftist who was a Marxist, but it was totally against Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, and that was part of the reason why he became forgotten.
He wasn't radical enough or something?
Well, I think he was more radical, but he wasn't. He had the courage to critique authoritarianism on the left. Mm-hmm. So,
which seems quite relevant to today's time.
I'm afraid it is, unfortunately. Yeah. So I think it is all too relevant. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So I think we have to have the courage to. I am just as much of a political radical as I was in my youth, but maybe a bit more willing to critique authoritarianism on my side. And I think we all have to find ways to do that.
And that's something I saw you talk at a Heterodox event, and that's something that really came across in your talk that I appreciated a lot. Why don't we switch now to the Jordan Peterson thing? I thought it might be good to talk a little bit about, for the audience who may not understand the background, what happened, just to walk through the story of how this unknown Canadian professor lecturing at U of T became an international celebrity.
Yeah, well, I think sort of like a very influential undergrad teacher. So he had a very popular class at the University of Toronto, because that's one of the things about universities, the research university. There's lots of really good teachers in universities, but the incentives are all for research. And so the university is incentivized against really like putting your heart and soul into undergrad teaching. And he was someone who did that. He was a very, very popular teacher. And he had publishing and did research, but he was kind of more someone who really connected with undergrads. So that was his forte. And he had taught at Harvard for a while, and then he was at U of T, tenured in the psychology department. He was also a clinician. He also had clients. He would sort of do therapy. That was his niche, a professor, psychologist, and a clinician. And he started to go on TV a little bit. But TV Ontario was this kind of the Steve Paikin. Mm-hmm. And he'd gone on that, and he was involved in TVL also ran like a best lecturer kind of contest, because that's something I think we shouldn't, it's very faddish today, maybe, like, that the professor is not really kind of a sage on the stage. They should sort of be kind of like more just encouraging student involvement or student-centered. And there's some place for that, but there's also a place for like, someone with knowledge kind of doing really good lectures. So he was in that contest, and so I think he started to kind of think about him like moving in the public arena. And it's like, maybe 2013, 14, 15, and then 2016 he put 3 videos up on YouTube. And one of them was C-16, which was a federal law that put gender expression and identity into the criminal code and human rights code. And so he offered a critique of that legislation, and particularly oriented around whether it was requiring compelled speech, forcing people to use pronouns or to recognize an identity that they didn't necessarily see. So that was the firestorm that kind of made his name. He also did there was a second video that was essentially about anti-racist training at the University of Toronto, and he was quite critical of it.
And what year was that?
2016.
Okay, so it's pretty early on still, right?
Yeah. And then the third one was kind of like he was basically offering to sell these little stickers at cost. And he was asking university students to stick these political correctness with an arrow through it on kind of posters that they thought were kind of like one-sided.
Okay, interesting.
Without stopping the event from happening or ruining the poster, but just to kind of signaling. So I had these 3 videos. That was but it was the first one that created a firestorm.
And so what happened?
He got some letters from his dean suggesting, kind of warning him, suggesting he may have crossed some kind of line in terms of human rights and kind of issues. And so I think he was, concerned about his job, a bit nervous about that. And then there was a free speech rally at the University of Toronto where kind of different sides were, and then the university tried to kind of quell that by having like a panel where a law professor and kind of some other professor kind of like offered criticisms of him, although they seemed to be not being all that fair-minded, I think, and it was a bit of a mess.
Okay.
And then I teach at McMaster, and he basically went. He was going to give a talk at Western, and he stopped at McMaster on a Friday night and gave a talk at McMaster, and the students deplatformed him. They just kind of yelled and screamed at him and stopped him from speaking.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then his wife had been with him, and she had a phone video, and he went on the lawn outside and he continued to talk, and the students so it was a very dramatic thing. I think the students thought this was a good idea at the time, but my viewpoint is this was a very illiberal thing to do, and
to shout someone down and not let them talk.
Yeah, backfired, helped make them famous. So I think that's sort of, and then there's a whole bunch of, he did an interview in Britain, and one of the innovators, Kathleen Newman, kind of like was really not very generous in the way that she tried to paint him into a corner, and he was very effective.
It was kind of that gotcha journalism where they're trying to get the person to say something so they can say, I'm superior to you or something.
Yeah. So that's sort of the beginning of it, and it just kept. He was very effective, and he was raising money on Patreon for a while, and his audience kept growing. The more people tried to cancel him, the more famous he got, and it kind of like built from there. Yeah. So
one of the things you identified about Peterson that makes him a little different from others is that he has a lot of these different aspects to his career. Like, he's not just an academic; he's a clinician. He's a public speaker. He's an entrepreneur. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think, so it's again it's like the sociology of intellectuals. So I've been studying famous intellectuals, how they get famous, how they got forgotten. And I don't think there's any case of an intellectual who got so famous so quickly.
As Jordan Peterson.
I don't think there's anything even remotely. And it's kind of like some of it has to do with, it's obviously like the internet. I mean, if it wasn't for the internet, this wouldn't have happened. And it was something to do with the Trump years. And it's something about his own particular form of charisma. So there's specific things. But what I want to push, this is the sociological angle, which has its limitations. But if you'll humor me, I'll lay it out. I think he played like 8 different sociological roles at the same time. And there's no other case of someone who's doing that. So he's an academic professor. He's a clinician who has clients, does therapy. He's an entrepreneur who likes to make money and sell things. He was an innovator. He wasn't like when I studied Erich Fromm, and he basically became famous by writing paperback books when paperback books was a thing. But he didn't create new forms of books. He just kind of used the existing technology. But Peterson was innovating with the long form podcasts and going on YouTube and things like that. So he was an innovator, a media innovator, following Joe Rogan, but pushing it a little bit further. He was also a public intellectual, someone who writes about general political issues. He was a spiritual leader who was a kind of a preacher who tried to talk about issues of kind of ultimate meaning. And he was a celebrity. And to sort of play these 8 roles at the same time is very unique. And what I would say is they don't really go together. They don't really fit together.
It sort of worked for him in some ways.
Well, yeah, it worked for him because putting them together exposes some of the limitations of each of the different forms. So the academic, the professors kind of, they tend to be secular. They tend to be experts. They tend to focus on research. So his combining the spiritual leader and the clinician kind of exposed the things that the academics weren't doing. And academics were upset. So they tried to deplatform him, which creates more attention for him. I think if you're a spiritual leader, it's a very different thing from being a professor.
Yeah.
So it's like tensions that worked for him because he was saying things that were different from what other people were saying. And the response that he gave rise to just fueled the attention that he was getting. That's what I would say.
What's your take on that? What do you like and don't like about some of his content, his approach?
I don't agree with him politically. So I'm more on the left. When you talk about whether you like Jordan Peterson or whether you agree with Jordan Peterson, the first thing you got to do is ask which Jordan Peterson you're talking about, because there's these 8 roles, right? So for the academic role, I think he's right that there needs to be more viewpoint diversity in the university. I think he's absolutely right.
Yeah,
I think he's also right that there's a crisis of the research university, that we're not doing a good enough job getting students into ideas and kind of being a place where the university is the place if you want to talk about the most important issues of the day. I'm not sure the university is the center of that right now. And I think he's right about that. I do think he's right that the universities need to be talking to students and helping them think about the big issues around meaning and what they're going to do with their lives, not just their sort of the narrow professional concerns.
Sure.
So I think he's right about all that. His alternative, I'm not sure I totally agree with that, but kind of exposing those problems, I think he's right. As a clinician, I definitely think he had this unique combination of Carl Jung and kind of spiritual thinking with basically behavioral cognitive therapy and sort of like, clean your room.
Yeah. And
I think that was very original and very different. And I think, and he was willing to sort of offer these ideas. I do think that, I don't think it's true that all of his followers are white men, young white men. I mean, first off, there's nothing wrong with speaking to and trying to help white young men with their problems. They matter too. But he has a diverse audience and lots of women and, racialized young people find what he says powerful and helpful. What I think he saw as a clinician, because he's bringing in this other stuff to the clinician, clinicians like helping people deal with their personal problems. And he was really concerned with that, clean your room, But he was bringing in these other things. There was a crisis for young people around masculinity. We're not really doing a good job talking about issues of masculinity. There's a drug crisis. There's a kind of crisis of meaning. There's a whole bunch of things. There's an economic crisis. And he was willing to talk about those things, connect these social crises to people's personal troubles.
Mm-hmm.
He's totally right about that. I think the spiritual crisis, I think sociologists don't like to do that, or academics don't like to do it. We're so very secular. So he's sort of bringing in something that we don't really want to touch. And I do think there's a crisis of meaning in the society.
So he's addressing a lot of gaps that are in the market in a way, right?
That's a really good way to put it. I think that's right. I think he addressed a bunch of gaps because he's doing different things. It comes from coming at it from different roles. He's sort of putting things together and forcing us to deal with that. So, that's what I would say. I don't disagree with all of these things. He's not wrong about everything, but I tend to come from the other side of the political. But I think he's exposed that the traditional ways of thinking about things aren't really adequate. The thing about sociology is that there's this old joke about kind of, how many sociologists it takes to screw in a light bulb, and it's not the light bulb that needs changing, it's society and its social structure. So we tend to, reduce everything to society and the group, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of social, historical, structural causes for people's problems, but the idea that it's only about that, it's only social, is really not very helpful. And you have to look at personal responsibility and personal choices, and kind of and he's pushing that. Yeah. And he's totally right about that. It's about the balance, where do we find in the balance? Mm-hmm. And we've gone too far in one direction. So it's very helpful, I think.
Interesting. And are there other people who are inspired by his take on those things who are on the left who are trying to address that type of gap in the market?
Yeah, I think there are. I think Jonathan Haidt he's not so much on the left anymore, more consider himself a moderate. Yeah, I think there's lots of people. I think that position, I'm hoping that's what's going to happen. That people will follow in the path of those issues and try and rethink some of the ways that we've been thinking about things, and integrate some of the insights, maybe not some of the analysis and some of the explicit politics. But I think there's lots of people doing that.
When I think about my reaction to Peterson's work, one of the things that I liked about what he was doing was he was putting voice to something that a lot of people were thinking and feeling in the public, but they were too scared to say, or too scared to voice, or they don't want to get canceled, so they just kind of keeping quiet. But having someone get out there and have the bravery to say it out loud in public.
Totally agree. And, this is where you talk about Christopher Rufo, and I have different opinion with him, but, I do think it's a bit of a misreading to think about professors as sort of Marcusean revolutionaries, because the truth is, professors ultimately, if you took away their parking spot or made them teach a little extra classes, or they didn't get the Friday class day where they don't want to teach those kind of things, that's what professors really get angry about. For most professors are not revolutionaries, or you're really quite conformist, really, And so even though I disagree with Peterson quite strongly, I do respect his willingness to speak out. Mm-hmm. And I do think people responded to that. And say the trans issue, the gender identity expression issue, that is an issue that there's a variety of positions on that question. But the idea that you could shut down the debate and not have any conversation about puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones or surgeries, particularly for young people, underage young people, and that you could basically, and then you could shut down all debate about women's spaces and the tensions between, treating every human being as precious, and treating everybody with respect, and bullying gender nonconforming people. No, there's no excuse for that. But there's parents and women have everybody really have a right to have a conversation about this big change that's been happening, and so we have to talk about it. And he was willing to talk about it. Give him credit for that.
Like, I think, Chris, I'm sympathetic to the Rufo argument in the sense that I do think a lot of bad ideas kind of jump ship from academia in activist circles.
Yeah, I agree.
And they're using these ideas in ways that aren't really very helpful in the real world.
I agree.
Whether it's certain bizarre forms of DEI or some activism around the gender stuff or any number of these things. But they're also shutting down anyone's ability to have a say in what the answer might be to some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And I guess where I would come at it a little bit different from Rufo and Peterson, I see it as a little more, that's maybe the sociology about this. But what I would say is that some of the ideas that were not that helpful, they came out of the feminism and the civil rights movement gave rise to a lot of positive changes. But I do think that kind of also created, and some ideas were not allowed to be expressed and people weren't being represented in universities. But once that change happened, there was a tendency for some of these ideas to kind of germinate and kind of
like the sort of dark side of some of those bad ideas. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that once you kind of eliminate the injustices, you create a bunch of academics and theories, and there's a tendency that those ideas become out of touch and kind of extreme and not very helpful. But I guess what I would say with Peterson and Rufo is that the places where, like say, when Peterson's basically saying it's postmodern neo-Marxism or Marxism, right? And it's kind of for Rufo, it's kind of Marcuse and things. But I just like thinking it sociologically. The places where some of those ideas were germinated were in elite private colleges in the United States, places with massive endowments. Harvard has a $50 billion endowment. So it was Harvard and Columbia and Yale. There was where these ideas really germinated. So
they're very elitist.
Elitist, yeah. So you could say it's like Marxism or radicalism, but it all could also be kind of the consequence of too much privilege and too much kind of intellectual elitism.
Yeah, luxury beliefs.
Luxury beliefs, and it's a lovely phrase, and he's right. So I kind of see it less as the function of like too much radicalism, but too little.
Misplaced radicalism?
And too much too little radicalism.
Yeah.
In other words, it's sort of like, why wouldn't we have I don't agree with Rufo and Donald Trump, but I do think that I've always thought that these private colleges, their endowments, they don't pay taxes on those endowments. They don't pay property taxes.
Yeah.
So I think it was a bit of a problem that even Bernie Sanders, I'm more of a Bernie Sanders person, but Bernie Sanders wasn't calling for taxes on endowments. He wasn't calling for property taxes for those institutions. So I think that the problem with those institutions was the institutional arrangements and the money that gave rise to these luxury beliefs was part of the problem. And so I like to think about spreading education and knowledge around to everybody. And if you do that, then you're going to have to deal with differences. You're going to have free marketer people and libertarians and, intellectual conservatives. And we got to figure out some ways of having institutions where we can talk those things out.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think one of the problems it's because it wasn't just academia where this was going on. Like people were leaving the academy and going into elite positions in a variety of institutions, and the government and education, and taking this kind of baggage of like identity politics and everything with them.
Well, I'm going to try and come up with a way of disagreeing with you, but I don't on this. I think you're right. You're absolutely right.
But you just kind of wish it was more maybe returned to a bit more materialist, classist kind of analysis.
Yeah, not in a 19th century, the class struggle kind of things. But yeah, I think I'd like to live in a world where everybody has a place to to sleep, and you don't have the levels of inequality we have in the world, and people in the streets in Toronto here. So I'd like to move towards that kind of world, and you have the markets, and business people are should play a role in making that happen. So we've got to find some arrangements to make a better world. So and some spaces where we can have conversations about that. But you definitely don't want sort of a elite-driven ideas from Harvard kind of doing social engineering on the rest of us. And there's a little bit too much of that happening.
I wouldn't have minded it so much if they were doing a good job, but it seems like they're kind of failing. The level of competency in a lot of elite institutions seems pretty low right now.
A lot of bad ideas. I mean, I'm not gonna deny that. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to return a little bit to the academy side of things. So one of my previous guests on the show, Scott Miller, he's a historian who finished his PhD. And when he came on the show, he used this pseudonym, Scott Miller, because he doesn't want to use his real name because he has conservative views on things.
Wow.
He wants to get a job in academia, but he felt like if he expressed conservative views publicly under his own name, he wouldn't be able to get a job.
I think that's appalling. I don't think he's paranoid.
Yeah. But how can we deal with that problem? And obviously the Heterodox Academy is trying to make inroads into that. Are there any other things we can do with that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think the Rufo approach is really gonna work, because what you're really gonna get is just more civil war in universities, and you're gonna have like kind of right-wing universities and left-wing universities, and I don't know. I don't think that's really that helpful.
Yeah, I guess the argument for that would be that the cultures within themselves are not able to change themselves because they are so dominated by a certain ideology. They can't really police themselves or get themselves out of that.
Yeah,
it's almost like a political approach needs to happen.
I mean, I'm not going to disagree that something has to happen from outside the university, and maybe it'd be like a little bit more of a scalpel than a sledgehammer. Yeah. But I do agree. I mean, I would love to see sociology open its mind to a much greater range of viewpoints. I mean, certainly in a small. I mean, I think on universities, I do think that the deplatforming needs to stop. Mm-hmm. That you really it's a serious mistake for universities, and you're losing the public. They are losing the public. There's a major institutional crisis in universities coming. And so for me, universities need to be the place where the kind of conversations you're having with your listeners on your podcasting, they should be happening in the universities.
Yeah, I mean, one would hope, right?
And invite you in and have conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's one thing I think I feel really strongly about. We don't model it very well. I don't think we need to be yelling at each other and screaming at each other, but we need to be modeling the kind of conversations we're having here, and and preventing deplatforming. Like, I think we have to be really tough on that. And it's totally unacceptable, in my opinion, to deplatform people who are, say, critiquing Zionism or arguing for Israel and defending Zionism. That those positions both have to be allowed, and gender critical perspective. Those are the two issues. Heterodox did a survey, and those are the two issues: the Middle East and the trans issues that people are most.
That's the most contentious right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have to do those issues in the university in a structured way, not like some Twitter and X and. It's kind of everybody just jumps in. You have to have structures. I believe in structures where you kind of. We basically make the conversation productive by thinking it through. So we need like some organizational structures you can't just come in and talk about anything anytime you want. But we're not doing a good job of that. And I think if we were doing that, we could start maybe rebuilding trust with the public. And the same thing I would say with our media, like the CBC. I would like to see the CBC be really expanded so that conservatives and moderates would see their viewpoints represented in a significant way.
They definitely help their chances of continued funding if they did that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No question. Yeah.
It's interesting to see that because you're further on the left than I am. And so that you're still interested in fostering that. Like, it's like your passion for ideas and for engaging is kind of trumps your political gamesmanship or something like that. I don't know.
Well, maybe, but it's also sort of like I just don't really see any other way. I mean, my teacher was this guy, Michael Harrington. He was the founder of the DSA. So your listeners should go back and listen to his speeches. And he was a political radical, but he believed in what he called visionary gradualism. So you have to sort of like make changes slowly, not like immediately, but you have to have a vision for a whole different world. And the thing is, we could have debates about, we've talked a little bit before about kind of markets and Hayek and free, but it seems to me it's not for you and me to figure out the balance of what that's going to happen. That's going to be decades and centuries. People are going to figure out what's the right balance between markets and cooperatives versus state-run. So you have to, if you want to make social change, you have to allow experiments, and you have to allow multi-parties. You can't, and that's the only way you're going to kind of find what kind of approach would work better. So it's also my politics. I kind of want to, you have to experiment and you have to get feedback, too much market.
And feedback is the problem, right? I mean, that's kind of why a lot of free marketers are free marketers, because they think that the feedback mechanism is built into the free market versus an ideological system which doesn't really accept feedback.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that piece of it. I think we could figure out ways of having political debate and multi-parties and kind of, not on the micro level. I mean, obviously some things markets are better at, but I do think there's some bigger things and some priorities that maybe political decisions might be called for. But the point is, it's a kind of it's a political process, and it has to be an open political process, and the society has to seek feedback from people. Mm-hmm. So I don't see any way of making a better world without that.
Yeah. Where do you think Canada's at right now in that? I mean, I would like to put things in the Canadian context.
Yeah, sure.
Where do you think we are there right now? It seems like we have a funny mix of politics here right now. Like the States, at least, they have a legitimate conservative power down there that can voice opposition to certain leftist sides of things. Yeah. Whereas up here, we don't really have much of that. We don't have much dialogue going between conservatives and the left.
Yeah, I'm an old-fashioned NDPer, so I kind of vote NDP. But I really wish the NDP would focus a bit more on the kind of social class issues and leave aside the cultural wars. And I don't think they would have a majority. They might have but I kind of would like them to do the sort of social class focus and the unions and the like. And I think that probably the Liberals will win, but I'm not a fan of the thing I would say about the Liberals is that essentially, instead of having like a principled centrist, which is, I'm not a centrist, but I would respect them more if they were principled centrists, and they would sort of like have a political viewpoint and stand on it. And generally what they do is find some charismatic leader, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Michael Ignatieff, Justin, and Carney's not so much charismatic, but kind of
credentialed.
It's credentialed. Yeah, it's a credentialed. Yeah, that's true. And I have a problem with that, like this sort of the constant credentialing. But also the bigger thing is they're basically saying, vote for us because Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So I think that's unprincipled. I think it'll probably win this time because Donald Trump.
It'll work, yeah.
I think it will because Donald Trump has kind of really, scared people and people are reacting to that. But I don't think it's a good situation. I would rather have a principled centrist party and then a principled NDP. And then, I like to see a kind of the emergence of a real conservative tradition in Canada. and that it is at the table, it's in the CBC, and we can work it out, or not.
I mean, hopefully it would the competition of those ideas would actually make for better ideas in the long run.
That's what I think, and I think the podcasters and the social media have kind of torn apart that the consensus and the ability to sort of dominate that the elites had, but it hasn't really replaced it with a good conversation, because it kind of tends to be polarized. But I would put a lot of the blame on the liberal establishment by shutting people up or smearing people. I think people are tired of being called racists or transphobes or fascists for having principled disagreements with the liberal or the left consensus. So I think that's unacceptable, and it's a serious problem, and it's connected to the Jordan Peterson problem, because that's that was what he was. A lot of people admired him because he was helping them find a voice for their criticisms. But I would blame the liberal elites for that.
I wonder where this is going to go. Would you have any predictions about where all this media landscape is going to go? I'm interested in the media landscape because I'm sort of participating in podcasting and things like that. But it seems like it's growing in power, in influence versus traditional institutions.
Yeah, I really I'm really late to this, and I just I don't really have institutional kind of. I don't keep up on that. I mean, I would like to sort of have it more structured, though. I think.
In what way?
I don't know, but I don't mean liberal elite structured. It's just some sort of. It's a little bit. It's so fragmented now. That's the problem. These bubbles and the fragmentation. That it seems to me the countries and it doesn't do as good to have total fragmentation. And so I do think, I don't know how it's going to happen over the next decades or so, but it seems to me we have to find ways so that moderate and conservative voices are given a place at the center of the national conversations.
Yeah.
And how to do that, I don't really know. But that seems to me, because if the conversations aren't happening in the mainstream in a play that everybody is participating in, or at least has basic trust in.
Yeah.
I don't know how you do that. I don't see. I mean, I don't even watch the CBC right now. I just I don't.
You and me both. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't. I'm afraid the trans issue, but really for me was the issue that I just lost all trust in them. I mean, I think it's a very complicated emotional issue, and I think people could talk about it in maybe better ways and trying to find some compromise around this. But I'm afraid the CBC just hasn't been serious. There are some obvious issues that people have a right to raise, and people have been, smeared and or silenced. So that was the issue for me. I just really didn't trust their viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of funny coming from a leftist in a way that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't think it's funny, I think it's kind of for me, it's kind of it's sort of core to my leftism.
Yeah.
That people have a right to free speech, and they have the right to, of course, you're obviously right. I mean, it's obviously right. There's a strain of leftism, an authoritarian left, from Stalin to Mao and to cancel culture today, that it's not unreasonable for you to see that as part of the left tradition. It is. But it's not my left. So, yeah, I think we have to work that out. And everybody's precious, and people who have different they express their gender differently. They're precious, and women's spaces are precious, and families and their ability to kind of guide their children through a life, that's a precious thing too. So I don't really see.
It's not, the conversation is not happening in the CBC or in most of Canadian media, right?
It's not happening. It's not happening in the universities. It's that. That's something that you can't really talk about and open, and that's appalling. So I'm for the universities and, keep them going. And you could say it's just my job, so I'm protecting my job or fair enough. But I don't see a better alternative. But the way it is right now is not working. Like we have to open up our conversations. And so I don't know how that's going to happen in the universities. I don't know how you could combine kind of like public funded broadcasting and with private, some kind of combination that I don't know what that would look like. But again, that's another reason why I'm really not into closing things down or giving an answer. I don't think it's sort of like, leftists have tried that, a 10-year plan, a 5-year plan. That's kind of the problem. That is one of our legacies is sort of the Stalinist legacy that we can't pretend that didn't happen. It did happen. And so I don't like to kind of come up with a plan that sort of like, I think we have to figure it out. I don't know what that would look like, but podcasters like yourself definitely going to be part of it. I think so.
Before we go, I hear that you're writing a book right now.
Right.
And do you have a title for your book yet?
Yeah, the Jordan Peterson phenomena. Okay. How an obscure Canadian academic became the most hated and loved public intellectual in the world.
That's good. I like the title. And when can we expect this book to hit the shelves?
Well, it might be a couple of years. Okay. It takes me. I mean, I have my little sociological theory, and then I'm going to go through this different stages of Peterson's career, and I've kind of decided that there's a fifth stage. When he moves to Arizona, and with the Trump attacks on Canada and the thing, I think it's going to be there's going to be something different.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, I don't know what he is. Maybe he's a danger of kind of a little bit of the Wayne Gretzky phenomena. He could suffer for kind of being too close to the Trumpist movement, and Canadians might be angry about that.
Yeah.
So I think there's going to be something. And I think his legacy is going to be shaped by what happens with the Trump government and sort of whether they succeed or whether that unravels.
Yeah.
It's going to look very different. So I'm probably going to get writing and then kind of like write the final chapter when we have some sense of how that's playing out.
Yeah.
Both for the U.S. and for Canada.
Yeah. And if people want to find more about your work or follow what you're doing, where can they go?
Oh, the McMaster website. I got all my stuff up there. Or if you just Google Neil McLaughlin, McMaster Sociology, I got a whole bunch of podcasts on YouTube. You can get them. Yeah, if you Google that on our.
Do you have your own podcast?
No. Okay. I just people ask me like this
so
one.
Guest appearances.
Yeah,
okay.
There's a bunch of them. Yeah. And
okay.
I kind of it's a sociology podcast, and I give a talk at UBC.
Okay.
And so there's a bunch of them. Yeah.
Cool. Well, it's been such a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you so much.
And I really like your approach and your commitment to, viewpoint diversity and discussion and dialogue and everything. It's inspiring for me. So,
well, you're inspiring to talk to because you're taking ideas and take them to the public. So we need to follow your example in the university and join you in common conversation. So thank you.
That's it for this episode of Viewpoints. Thanks for listening. If you like viewpoint diversity and you want to hear more like this, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit viewpointspodcast.ca. And if you have ideas for topics or guests, we'd love to hear from you. You can connect using the contact form on the website, or you can send me an email directly at sean@viewpointspodcast.ca.